So can everyone hear me okay out there? Does it look like the audio is showing up on the microphone? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience. So tonight's the second to last night of our year. And my title for this talk is Everything is Fresh and New. Looking forward towards the new year, of course, and also looking back towards the newness, the uniqueness of this really interesting 2020. This phrase, everything is fresh and new, as some of you may know, comes from the Shasui ritual, which is done in many ceremonies, where the officiant in like Jukai or Tokudo will take the Shasui ki, this evergreen sprig, and dip it in wisdom water, and then share it with the 8 directions, their own head and the head of those who are there. And it's symbolic of transmitting the wisdom, the freshness, the newness of life in this moment. And it's the cleansing ritual that we do at the beginning of each of those ceremonies. And we'll be doing it again, if you'd like to see, on January 19th at the winter practice period, where Shoryu, who's behind the camera, thank you, Shoryu, and Dainin will be ordained as novice priests. So at the end of the year, we often recall the year's lessons and think of what resolutions or commitments we wish to make for the coming year. And yesterday in our weekly newsletter, Roshi Joan wrote this beautiful reflection of the process. She writes, "Yes, this year has been a crisis of the heart and mind that goes right to the core of how we live as social beings, how we deal with fear and loss, and how we die, and how we serve. In the midst of all this, one has to ask, how are we doing? What are we learning? How have we resourced ourselves in the midst of lockdown or the high demands and stress of caregiving? What have we taken refuge in? How are we dealing with the many losses we are experiencing now, including the massive loss of human life at this time? What does loss and radical uncertainty teach us? How have we served others? What does it mean to live by vow in this time of great suffering?" These could all be said perhaps to be kind of koans of our time, and wonderful things to reflect on and remember. And if you'd like to read the full piece, you can find it both in our newsletter at upaya.org/newsletters, which sure you might put up. You can also find it on the blog, upaya.org/blog. So to kind of go into a little bit of that, which is kind of what you do at this time. COVID pandemic has been a time of great learning for me, for sure, and for many of us. And at Upaya, I say we all basically are doing really well. And I feel so grateful that there hasn't been any sickness here, even of a cold, because of our strict policies and procedures and the adherence of our people. So thank you all for being so good. And also because we've had to close down, it's been a vastly different year than we've ever had. We usually have a couple thousand people come through our temple doors every year, maybe 3,000 even, including for the Dharma talks and personal retreats. And this year we've had, not many. On the other hand, we've been able to have our cloud zendo open to many times more, tens of thousands of people. I think there's 20 or 30,000 people online right now watching this, or maybe just 20 or 30 people. Thank you for joining. It's especially Hoda, who was in the Cloud Zendo before any of this happened years ago when we first started live streaming talks. So I'm grateful for your participation. And I'm also so grateful, both myself and on behalf of UPI, for all the people that made this possible, the generosity of our benefactors, because without the livelihood that we have in serving people on the ground, we've made everything free by donation, because we just felt you can't charge, at least when we were at the beginning of doing our technology and having audio issues, let's just make it free. And even though we did that, the donations came and people appreciated what we did, and we've been able to survive and thrive in that. So deep bows to everyone who helped us with that. So I very much enjoyed, working out the tech, although it can be stressful at times, especially when I'm supposed to be up here and there's a loud hum on the audio and Roshi texts me and I'm like, but it helped get my mind off the talk in a way. So I suppose it was good, because I still always get nervous right before I come up. But also, in addition to all the technological things we've done, I'm sitting here with 9 people in Zendo, and there's about, I think, 11 or 12 in our pod that are just, we don't go out, nobody comes in, and it's been so intimate and so close the way we've been together these, 9.5 months. And some people have come in at various times. Some people were here. Joe's our newest, and he kind of dived right into the deep intimacy of community. And there's a phrase in Zen, warm hand to warm hand. And I feel like that feeling of intimacy is so accentuated by the times. And so we have both sides of a vast kind of connection, interconnectivity with thousands of people. And then our close-knit group where where Soshin's in the kitchen cooking us our miso soup. Thank you, Soshin. And we'll sit down and eat together and clean together, and just small. And again, through the generosity of our benefactors and through the hard work of especially Roshi Joan, who's taken on the things like writing the newsletter and so on. So speaking of our resident program, we've basically closed down the program as it was before, but we are still accepting applications for people that could be a really good fit. You'd have to go through a 2-week quarantine, of course, go through the application process, but we welcome you to apply. And if it's a good fit, then you can come join us in our intimate group. And sure, we'll post the link for that. And then of course the programs we've been doing, which I mentioned, are not just a bunch of amazing programs that we did and are gone, like they often are. I mean, we've always had the podcast, but now all of our programs are basically, you can experience them just as you would live, because the videos are online, the resource pages are all online, and you can still register for them. So starting with the spring practice period in April, and then a series of amazing retreats, the Awaken Action, women's koan retreats, and Hidden Lamp and sessions, and all of this stuff is there still. You go to upi.org/programs. You can register for these. You can access the videos, the Zoom videos, even the transcripts of all the talks. They're auto transcripts, so they can be really funny at times, but you can search for phrases. I mean, it's really incredible, and it's all offered freely. And of course, donations are always welcome, but don't feel like you have to. Please come and partake of this richness. So my kind of recommitments for the year, I want to continue learning from these changing conditions. I think there's great hope with the vaccine. Of course, there's still great tragedy. I read an article in the Times this morning about a doctor who got the shot, but was so torn because people were literally dying in the hospital as they got the shot, the vaccine. And so, we still have to be so careful. And so meticulous, I think. And hopefully when enough people can get the vaccine and we can start coming together, who knows when, in it, 6 months, a year, 2 years, we'll be able to come back. But for now, the not knowing is great. And I hope to continue to accept that. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where we're going to go or how it's going to happen, and learn from it. And I also want to continue serving here with our small community and anyone who can join us, and to go deep into study and practice. I've so valued preparing for this talk and preparing for the upcoming winter practice period, which is on koans. And I really look forward to continuing that and to continuing to dive deep into Dogen and koans and, well, mostly Dogen and koans, this and that. So, and if you'd like to register for the winter practice period, sure, we'll post the link. This is not completely an infomercial, I promise. But I just wanted to share what I'm excited about at Upaya, and to ask you to join us, to participate, because there's so much here. And when we've got, 100 people on Zoom to talk with, so many things come up for us. So much wisdom. And then that's the only way you'll get to see Hoda. So I'm just saying. So we're in the winter practice period. We're studying koans, as I said, especially the Muman Kan, the gateless gate. And from January 5th to the 29th, we'll have 2 Zazen Kais, we'll have a 7-day sesshin, and we're going to have every day almost, except for personal practice days, 5 days a week, we're going to have a seminar or a talk. There's going to be a bunch of talks from teachers like Roshi Enkyo, Roshi Norman Fisher, Sensei Kathy, Sensei Wendy Johnson, Sensei Shinzan, Sensei Kaigetsu, Natalie Goldberg, Monshin, Hoshi Kozan, and myself. And we're also going to have, this is cool, I don't know if you guys know this yet, actually, koan presentations. So we'll be getting into, you do know that, right? You know that you're going to pick a koan and then you're going to do a presentation to a small group, and everybody that joins the practice period is going to get to do that. So we'll get in groups together and we'll present our koans. So please join that. And so I was studying for this practice period in the Muman Kan, and also reading these 2 books that we've put on the resource page, the Zen Dust, which is also called the Zen Koan, with Ruth Fuller Sasaki and Ishu Miura, is that how you say his name? And also the Muman Kan. Oh, and also, let's see, Zen Dust and Zen Sand, which is the capping phrases. And those are big tomes with lots of kind of resource literature, but the introductions are fairly short and are just quintessential about koans, and I hope we really dive into those. So I want to share a little bit of what I've learned so far from looking at a koan. I love koans because I already talked about koans so much in the last couple talks, but they have this way of pointing to paradox, or inviting you into paradox, and kind of stunning you at times with a shock or a kind of an aha moment, or humor, or it's funny. It's like they're like really good jokes, except a joke that liberates you from your mental afflictions. What could be better? So this is why I love koans. But you don't just read the koan and get it, right? You have to really work at it. And of course, in Soto Zen, in our school under Dogen, we really emphasize just sitting and following the breath and letting your thoughts go. So we're not sitting there working koans like that. But of course, Dogen is writing about koans all the time. And when we do studying koans is the way that we can get into this sense of how to access the non-conceptual, what we're doing on the cushion. And so as I was exploring this and thinking about, well, what should I talk about? I'm really called to this koan of what is the non-conceptual? What does that even mean? The non-conceptual is a concept but it's also not a concept. So already you've got a paradox, and trying to work with that has been really interesting the past little while. And as I was reading through Mumonkan, I came across case 24, leaving speech and silence behind. So a monk asked Fuketsu, in all earnestness, both speech and silence are concerned with re, subjectivity, and me, objectivity. How can we transcend them? Both speech and silence are concerned with subjectivity and objectivity. How can we transcend them? Fuketsu said, I always think of Konan in March, where partridges are chirping among hundreds of fragrant blossoms. Was that an easy one? I always think of Konan, this is south of the Yangtze River, in March, where the partridges are chirping among hundreds of fragrant blossoms. So when I first read that, I thought, okay, well, that seems pretty clear, right? Here you've got this philosophical monk, a Dharma geek, as we might call them, of which we have a few in here. And, asking about the relative and the absolute, subjectivity and objectivity, the subtle and the separate. There are many words for it, but this is one of those examples of, tell me about the relative and the absolute. Basically, if the absolute is separate from the relative or is not the relative, then how is it the absolute? And I talked about this in another talk about, well, there's the absolute as opposed to the relative, and then there's the real absolute, which is inclusive. But then if the absolute is inclusive, then what is it absolute of in relation to the relative? And you have a reverse. Okay, Kozan put his hand on his head, so I better shift gears. So that is the monk asking Fuketsu, right? Monk comes to the master, and the absolute and the relative. And so you might expect a Zen shout or hitting him with a stick or silence, but he says this beautiful experience of the spring in March. And that does it, that to me, when I first read that, I was like, oh yeah, that's a way to leave speech and silence behind. Because the monk, remember, he's not just asking about the relative and the absolute, he's tying them to speech and silence. So he's saying in silence is basically the absolute. You can manifest the absolute by being silent. Or in the relative is the words. But that's the kind of the relative absolute and the relative relative. So if Fuketsu says any words, he's falling into the relative. If he's silent, he falls into the absolute. So how do you leave words and silence behind? I keep expecting that Anshin's going to say something. But silence works. But here he says this experience. And so at first I was imagining, okay, so Fuketsu, he could have said, well, what are you experiencing in your body? We often say this in an interview. Well, what are you experiencing right now? Bringing you to your body. What's your lived experience now? And that's, of course, a place to go because that's what's real in this moment. But he didn't do that. He didn't say, what are you experiencing? He didn't even say, what am I experiencing? He said, I always think of Konan in March. I always remember, or I constantly think of it. And it's like, that's interesting. So it's not present, it's a memory. But it's a memory of something, it's not present, but maybe in that moment, he was like really in that moment. Maybe that was a moment for him that he had that feeling of non-conceptuality. I think we all have those, if you want to, like you could call it your resource, right? You kind of imagine there was that time I really dropped away. Maybe it was in sesshin, maybe it was on the beach, maybe it was anywhere. And so I was imagining Fuketsu had a moment like that, and that this monk is asking, how do you leave silence and words behind? He says, well, I always think of this. I was like, okay, that works. even though it's kind of borrowed consciousness, as Roshi might say, but he remembers it. But then we learn something a little disconcerting. Mumon says in his commentary, Fuketsu's activity of mind is like lightning. He gains the road and immediately walks along. But why does he rest upon the tip of the Ancient One's tongue and not cut it off? Why does he rest upon the tip of the Ancient One's tongue and not cut it off? What he's referring to here is that that was actually a verse written by a previous author, a poet that lived 200 years before, named Toho. So the monk asks, how do you leave words and silence behind? And he recites a verse. And now I'm really baffled. I'm like, that's not direct experience. That's not even your own experience. That's somebody else's experience. How does that work? What is it? I mean, he didn't even smell the flowers. There were no birds. I mean, he didn't experience it, right? And somewhere in the commentary, maybe not Mumon, but one of the commentaries said, it's not even that great of a verse. Like, it's kind of an okay verse. It's not like one of the classic wonderful verses. And so now I'm baffled again. I thought I figured it out. So my mind keeps wanting to figure it out, right? And on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, that's the source of suffering, trying to figure things out, trying to put things in boxes, trying to reify things. But on the other hand, that's the process that you have to do. Like, you can't just start with the koan and be like, koan's non-conceptual. I'm not going to read any koans because they're all conceptual. Then you never get anything, right? So somehow you have to actually try to figure them out. Even though part of you knows you're not going to figure them out, but you got to try. And I think you really have to be like, yes, I get it. Now I get it. And then maybe you go to the Zen master in the room and you give your answer and they say, no. They ring the bell or something. Or they say, try again, if they're really kind. And so we don't do that kind of practice, but we can just do it on ourselves. Feel like, is that so? Okay, I think I got it, but maybe not. And you read some more commentaries, you read other things. In Zen Dust, or the Zen Koan, both are the same book, Ishomura Roshi quotes Hakuin. Hakuin Zenji is kind of the great koan master of Rinzai a couple hundred years ago. Hakuin says, your close examination of yourself must be as urgent as saving your own head were it ablaze. Your efforts to penetrate into your original nature must be as tireless as the pursuit of an indispensable thing. Your attitude toward the verbal teachings of the Buddhas and the patriarchs must be as hostile as that toward a deadly enemy. That's an interesting one. That caught me off guard when I first read it. Your attitude toward the verbal teachings of the Buddhas and patriarchs, so these writings, must be as hostile as that toward a deadly enemy. What does that mean? In Zen, he who does not bring strong doubt to bear upon the koans is a dissolute, knavish, good-for-nothing. Therefore it is said, underlying great doubt, there is great enlightenment. Where there is thorough questioning, there can be a thoroughgoing experience of awakening. So the koans, I think, are designed to help us have great doubt, to question everything. Because we might just say like, oh, the non-conceptual, I just sit in the non-conceptual. But we're actually in so many concepts that we don't even know we're in. We're locked in to identities and to stories and narratives. And you can just question them directly, but sometimes it takes a kind of a side. You can come from another side. You can come from a koan or a question, what is this? Or is that true? That way there's a little separation, but it goes deeper and deeper. And so we go on. Yamada comments, Yamada Roshi, who wrote the commentary on the Muman Kan version that we're reading, that's in our the resource page. So to return to the koan, the monk is asking, Both speech and silence are concerned with objectivity and subjectivity. How can we transcend them? So Yamada Roshi comments, both speech and silence are connected with subject and object, in other words, with the dualistic world. So now we get to the idea of duality and non-duality. The monk in this case knew that as long as we are confined to the world of dualistic concepts, we cannot free ourselves from the sufferings of the six realms. So in a way, it was like I kind of threw out that monk as just a Dharma geek stuck in his head. But actually, this is the fundamental question. How do we transcend duality? How do we stop seeing things as subject and object? It's so natural to us. And as we're taught in Buddhism, and especially this stream, that duality is the root of suffering. You reify self, you reify other. I want mine, I mean mine, push away what I don't want. And if you can cut through it, then you can be free of that suffering. So Yamada Roshi makes it easy for us. We should know that subject and object are intrinsically one. This is the most fundamental point of Buddhist teaching. It is the satori, or enlightenment of Zen. To intuit, experience, and realize this fact is the main reason for doing Zazen. To realize that subject and object are not separate. So how do I do that again? Missed it. It was there. I missed it. Yamada says, just try. See if you can say a phrase or some words without using your brain or mouth. Say a phrase without using your brain or mouth. Just say it. That was something. Bleh. She went, bleh. It was good. Show you. The eyebrow. Was it the left or the right? Without using words or your brain, just say it. Hand gestures. There's one finger, then there's three fingers, I guess. Thank you. The lion's roar? Is that the lion's roar? Yeah. So I wonder what Master Fuketsu was thinking or not thinking when the monk kind of asked him, where did it come from? Was he already thinking about it? Was it a verse on his mind? Did it actually remind him of an experience he had? Could he have said anything at all or nothing at all? After Mumon's commentary, he offers a capping verse. Fuketsu does not speak in his usual style. Before he says anything, it is already manifested. If you go on chatting glibly, you should be ashamed of yourself. Before he says anything, it is already manifested. I like to think that in this case, maybe in all cases, as Kozan was reminding me, that Sensei Fisher says, you should just assume that in all the cases, everybody's already enlightened. It's not that some are wrong and some are right, but that they're all enlightened. Nobody's getting it wrong. And of course, Mumon, in classic Mumon form, will say, like, you should be ashamed, or that was a stupid thing to say, but it's actually a compliment. So they say. So one way of conceptualizing, forgive me, the kinds of answers to that question, how do you transcend silence and words? You could say to manifest silence through words, which is kind of what he was doing by reciting a poem. He's manifesting a non-answer. He's not answering the question, but he's using words. So he's using words to show silence, to show his presence. And then the other thing you could do is to manifest words through silence. So that's the thundering silence of Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra, the lion's roar of the Buddha's noble silence. When someone asked him, is there a self? Is there not a self? He was silent. And they said that silence could be heard throughout the 10 directions and the 3 times. So that's the deep meaning, the words perhaps, behind the silence. This reminded me of one of our favorite fascicles, Only a Buddha and a Buddha. Dogen says, what is it like being undivided? To be undivided does not mean that you try forcefully to exclude intention or discrimination, or that you establish a state beyond intention. Being undivided cannot be intended or discriminated at all. So here he's explaining that you can't explain your way to it. You can't figure it out. You can't do it, right? So somehow you work with the koan, you try to figure it out, but you can't actually figure it out. But something happens. Somewhere in there you have like a moment of realization. And then maybe the next moment it's doubt. Or maybe you think you get it and you tell someone, like, I think I got it, this was it. And they say, okay, is that so? And then you keep going. Dogen continues, spring has the feeling of spring, and autumn has the look of autumn. There is no escaping it. So when you want spring or autumn to be different from what it is, notice that it can only be as it is. Or when you want to keep spring or autumn as it is, reflect that it has no unchanging nature. Now this is so cool because this is like actual practical advice. Like, what do you do to drop into a non-conceptual moment? Well, the first thing is that you notice that when you're not in it is because you're grasping something. You want something else. So maybe you feel, oh, it's too cold outside. I want to be warmer. And that feeling pulls you out of the moment. You're in kind of grasping mind. So his tip here is just remember that everything is as it is, right? And that perhaps your desires, your wants, your grasping is not as important as just what is. It's just cold, or it's just is what it is. It's not even cold. Maybe that can release us a little bit from that grasping. Or if you really want the things, oh, now it's so warm, I feel so good. And that one's a little harder because when you're pushing something away, it hurts, right? You don't want something, so you kind of have a goad to practice. But when you're in a good place and you're feeling good, it's easier to forget, I think, that you should also practice then. You think, oh, I don't want this to change. I love it the way it is, warm and comfortable. And then if you notice that you're doing that, you're grasping after something to stay the same, you just remember that nothing stays the same. As Roshi says, the itinerary is subject to reality. Everything is subject to change. And so those 2 tips, just remembering things are as they are, and they're always changing, can really help us, I think, at times stay with just this. The non-conceptual. So part of this exploration was I also was curious what modern philosophy, modern philosophy is huge, but just like what else was out there on what is non-conceptuality. Because even though I'm getting hints of it from the koans and tastes of it from Dogen, it's like, what do your people say about non-conceptuality? So I was doing some research, and I don't think Evan Thompson is necessarily your people, but he actually has some really interesting things to say about conceptuality and non-conceptuality. Evan Thompson is this wonderful philosopher, and was part of our Zen Brain program for a long time, Varela Symposium, and hopefully we'll get him back someday. But he wrote a book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And it's a really great book, I think, for all Buddhists to read about, or at least to peruse, about some of the reifications that Buddhists make about themselves. And he's actually doing a very Buddhist thing, you could say, an analysis, and a critical analysis, a kind of a, a Madhyamaka cutting of Buddhism or Buddhist modernism, Buddhist cosmopolitanism, and really questioning what underlies those beliefs and kind of these things. In any case, he says here, enlightenment, Buddhist modernists like to say, is a non-conceptual intuition of the suchness or as-isness of things. Right, we say that, right? But what do non-conceptual and suchness mean? If non-conceptual means by nature not conceptualizable, what justifies describing the realization as being of the nature, one concept, of how things are, another concept? What do nature and how things are mean? Isn't non-conceptual a concept? And we got into this really interesting discussion the other day about autological words. A concept is a concept, but non-conceptual is a concept that doesn't refer to itself. Can anything refer to non-conceptual? Does non-conceptual refer to anything? If it refers to something, isn't it a concept? Or are there things that are not concepts? Anyway, that was fun. How can a non-conceptual realization be reportable or describable in language? What could distinguish one non-conceptual realization from another? Are all non-conceptual realizations the same? Or they're different? Or can something that's not a concept be the same or different? Can it even exist? Is an existence a concept? How could a non-conceptual realization be integrated into the conceptual framework of understanding? And just what is meant by conceptual and non-conceptual anyway? So I love that. And what's so great, I think the first time I looked at this book, I didn't notice this, but there's a footnote there that says, to read more about the non-conceptual and conceptuality, he refers to the forthcoming article. So maybe it wasn't out yet, and it's still in pre-publication. So I think it's pretty recent. But this is Evan Thompson's article, What's in a Concept? Conceptualizing the Non-Conceptual in Buddhist Philosophy and Cognitive Science. I haven't had time to read it in full, and I'm sure he's posting it now if you'd like to check it out. It's like 70 pages. It's almost a book. But it's so cool. He goes into cognitive science and philosophy and Buddhist philosophy and Abhidharma and Zen and all kinds of stuff. And you'd think that as you're reading it, you think, well, maybe he's just saying that it's stupid, like there's no such thing, we shouldn't talk about it. But I don't think so. I think he's actually getting at something deeper. He's actually getting, in a way, to the root of that same question of the monk asking Fuketsu. He says in the article, from an inactive cognitive science perspective, informed by Buddhist philosophy, a concept is not a mental entity by which an independent subject grasps or represents independent objects, but rather one aspect of a complex dynamic process in which the mind and the world are interdependent and co-emergent poles. So I'll read it again because it's a lot of words. From an inactive cognitive science perspective, informed by Buddhist philosophy, a concept is not a mental entity by which an independent subject grasps or represents an independent object, but rather a concept is one aspect of a complex dynamic process in which the mind and the world are interdependent and co-emergent poles. I feel like he actually answers the monk in that. How do you leave words and silence behind? You realize the interdependence of words and silence. There are no words without silence. I suppose there's silence without words, but definitely words rely on silence to exist at all. So much more could be said about that, but I'm really looking forward to exploring this koan more. And I'll be giving a talk, I think, on the 25th during the session. Maybe I'll talk about this koan and kind of bring up anything else that may have arisen during our winter practice period. And so to close, I'll offer you my answer right now to the koan. How do you leave words and language behind? "长忆江南三月里，雉孤啼楚百花香。